At 4:15 on January 10, 2026, the North Atlantic lit up as the Russian flagship Admiral Gorshkov launched Zircon. There was no warning and no attempt at negotiation, just a hypersonic trail of fire racing toward the British support ship RFA Tide Force, now locked in the sights of the Russian Navy. The crew had 47 seconds. That was all the time left before the missile reached its designated impact point. The British sailors barely had enough time to spot the fast-moving signal on radar and realize how little room they had to respond. Moscow wanted this launch to send a message after the seizure of the Marinara and to show that Russia could put pressure on NATO whenever it chose. But as the clock ran down, another reality was taking shape. The Russians believed they were in control, yet somewhere in the darkness, an unseen U.S. Navy presence was already moving into position. The hunter was about to become the hunted, in a confrontation almost no one could have predicted. To understand why a support ship like RFA Tide Force became the focus of a Mach 9 demonstration, we have to go back to the vessel that triggered the entire chain of events, the Marinara. This was not a random interception. It was the result of a 4-month pursuit aimed at one of the most important links in the so-called Shadow Fleet, a network tied to illegal oil transfers. What made this ship stand out was the way it avoided detection. On December 21st, in an effort to shake off the USCGC Monroe, it reportedly sent 39 false SOS signals in a row, cluttering rescue communications. Then, by January 1st, 2026, it made an even bolder move. The ship changed its name to Marinara and temporarily sailed under a Russian flag, using a license that had been rushed through by the Russian Ministry of Transport on Christmas Eve. The goal was simple: turn a smuggling vessel into what looked like protected Russian territory at sea, with submarine support guiding it toward Murmansk. But NATO had already moved ahead. P-8, a Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft operating from Keflavik, Iceland, worked alongside British RC-135W electronic surveillance aircraft to verify the vessel's IMO identification number 9234567. That gave them solid evidence that the ship was sailing under a false flag. In that operation, RFA Tide Force played an essential support role, refueling Allied units and helping sustain the wider effort that boxed in the Marinara long enough for U.S. Special Forces to step in. By January 7th, Moscow was furious. Losing the Marinara was not just a financial setback, it was also an intelligence embarrassment, because it exposed a strategic shipping route Russia had been relying on. Analysts concluded that the Kremlin needed a rapid show of strength to push back against the West, and that is when Operation Shadow was set in motion. On January 8th, the destroyer Admiral Gorshkov and the Yasen M-class nuclear attack submarine left Severomorsk. In its notice to international maritime authorities, Russia described the mission as a routine technical patrol. But what unfolded at sea suggested something very different. The chosen target was RFA Tide Force. With a displacement of 39,000 tons, a top speed of only 27 knots, and only a handful of 20mm defensive guns, the British ship was an ideal target for intimidation, large, visible, and lightly armed. Overnight, from January 9th into January 10th, British sensors began to pick up clear signs of electronic interference. The Gorshkov's electronic warfare system sent out broad jamming pulses that disrupted the British ship's satellite links. Then the pressure increased. Electro-optical sensors aboard the British vessel recorded a Russian K-27 Helix helicopter dropping low and performing an aggressive close pass. Its searchlights were directed onto the deck, forcing Tide Force to activate defensive countermeasures, including flares and chaff. According to military experts, the move had two purposes: to rattle the British crew and to provoke the ship into revealing its radar frequencies for intelligence collection. Then came the most unsettling moment yet. British passive sonar picked up a metallic sound from below, consistent with the Yasen M submarine opening its torpedo tube doors and positioning itself to block any withdrawal. At nearly the same time, a calm Russian voice came over the international channel. Zircon loading. Mock target 20 nautical miles ahead. Notice confirmed. 47-second countdown. Maintain course. In other words, Russia was not planning to hit the British ship directly. Instead, it intended to detonate a hypersonic missile in front of it as a demonstration. For any captain, that is a worst-case scenario. And here is why. Tide Force was equipped with the Phalanx CIWS, a system originally designed decades ago to deal with much slower airborne threats. Zircon, by contrast, was closing in at Mach 9. That difference is enormous. It is the kind of gap that leaves almost no margin for reaction. Just as the tension reached its peak, a third factor entered the picture, one that would change everything. Moments before launch, Tide Force's sonar picked up an unfamiliar contact. It was small, fast, and did not match any known Russian platform in the area. Then a second one appeared. Two stealthy objects were approaching silently from the west. Would they get there before the missile left the launcher? At exactly 4:15:30, the launch order was given. A column of fire tore through the darkness over the North Atlantic. The three M22 Zircon shot out of its vertical launch system and accelerated sharply, climbing to roughly 30 kilometers in just seconds. At that altitude, its scramjet engine took over, driving the missile to around Mach 9, close to 3 kilometers per second. At that speed, the air ahead of the missile compresses so intensely that it forms a glowing plasma layer around the front section. For NATO, that plasma effect is one of the most difficult parts of the challenge. It can disrupt radar tracking, making the missile appear almost ghost-like on defensive displays, showing up, fading, then reappearing somewhere else. On Tide Force, the Phalanx system turned desperately, but there was little it could do. Captain Harrison reportedly had only enough time to shout over the loudspeaker, "Impact in 10 seconds. Brace, brace." Above them, the K-27 helicopter stayed on station. Moscow clearly wanted the footage. Images of a NATO crew facing a hypersonic demonstration would have been powerful material for domestic messaging. There was no direct hit on the British ship, but what followed was still dramatic. The Zircon entered the sea exactly 20 nautical miles ahead of Tide Force's bow, just as announced. Yet at hypersonic speed, the impact with the water created a massive kinetic event, comparable in force to a major conventional detonation. A towering column of water surged skyward. Then the shockwave hit, slamming into Tide Force's hull and shaking the entire 39,000-ton ship. From a technical point of view, Russia had achieved its immediate goal. The data had been gathered. The video had been captured. The British ship was still afloat, serving as a witness to the demonstration. It looked for a moment like a complete success. But just as the Russians were preparing to wrap up the exercise, the situation changed instantly. The Gorshkov's electronic warfare suite, one of the pride points of the Russian fleet, suddenly began registering collision alarms. The Parliament Redoute radar picture shifted from target lock to heavy interference. Then, emerging from the edge of the jamming zone, came two gray, low-profile craft with no visible bridge and almost no superstructure, moving at around 35 knots. These were the USVs Ranger and Mariner, uncrewed surface vessels from the U.S. Navy's Ghost Fleet Overlord program. They had not appeared by accident. Earlier, a U.S. P-8. A Poseidon had detected the Russian group and quietly coordinated the two robotic vessels into position, letting them drift with minimal signature for roughly 4 hours. Ironically, the very test zone Russia had established through its maritime notice had become the trap that boxed them in. At the same time, below the surface, the Yasin M submarine found itself under pressure as well. An Orca XLUUV emitted an active sonar ping right near the submarine's propeller zone. A clear signal that it had reached a favorable attack position if things escalated. On the surface, the message was even more direct. At a flanking distance of only 500 meters, launch hatches on USV Ranger opened, revealing SM-6 missiles. Then an automated U.S. broadcast went out over the international channel, closely following rules of engagement. Russian warship 41, weapons locked, auto defense sequence armed, alter course to 030 immediately. Those were likely the longest 30 seconds of the Russian captain's career. At that range, the Admiral Gorshkov was in serious trouble. Zircon and Caliber missiles were effectively unusable. They required distance to arm properly and stabilize after launch. Fired from so close, they would be little more than uncontrolled projectiles, and the blast risk could endanger the Russian ship itself. That left the ship's guns, but even those offered little comfort. Naval gun systems still need precious seconds to rotate, acquire, and engage. Against them stood highly automated defensive systems able to react in fractions of a second. Before Russian guns could bring sustained fire to bear, the US vessels could already have responded. And beyond the hardware, there was the psychological shock. The Russian captain was not facing traditional warships with visible crews. He was facing machines, systems that felt no fear, had no families waiting at home, and would not hesitate under pressure. If he fired, Russia would instantly be seen as attacking American assets. If his own ships were disabled, it would be a strategic humiliation. Even in the unlikely event he managed to destroy the robotic vessels, Washington would lose equipment, not lives. Then the position became even worse for Russia. Tide Force quietly moved behind the US robotic screen. The geometry was now perfect. Any attempt to pressure the British ship again meant crossing a barrier formed by two American uncrewed combatants. Silence settled over the Gorshkov's bridge. Only the hum of the ventilation and the tension in the command team remained. At last, the Russian captain took his hand off the launch controls, muttered a curse, and gave the order to turn away at maximum speed. The flagship of the Northern Fleet heeled over, trailing thick black exhaust as it tried to break contact. The Zircon launcher cooled. The standoff ended without another shot, but not without consequences. Russia may still have hoped to use the helicopter footage for its own narrative, likely framing the event as a successful suppression of a British provocation. That kind of messaging would have fit a familiar pattern, especially after the embarrassment surrounding the Marinara. But this time, the response came too fast. As soon as the Russian formation pulled back, US European Command released video from British and American electro-optical sensors showing the full sequence. The K-27 flying close to a stationary British vessel. The massive Gorshkov boxed in by two much smaller robotic ships. And finally, the Russian flagship turning away in a cloud of smoke. That footage undercut any attempt by Moscow to control the story. Still, this may not be the end of the issue, only the end of one chapter. If Zircon failed to deliver the political effect Russia wanted on the surface, some analysts now believe Moscow could shift more heavily toward asymmetric operations beneath the sea. That possibility is why names like Belgorod and the Poseidon underwater system are being discussed more often. And if that happens, future targets might not be warships at all, but the undersea infrastructure the West depends on every day, including fiber optic communication cables. So the real question may be this. If Russia leans further into underwater disruption, will the US Ghost Fleet still play a central role, or will the next contest move to a battlefield even harder to see?